Tonight, we begin with a story not about conquest, but about control. Not control over land, or armies, or enemies. But control over the one thing that matters most. The self. Long ago, the world was shaped by men who believed greatness was measured by how much they could take. Cities were counted. Kingdoms were claimed. Maps were redrawn with blood and steel. Among these men stood an emperor whose name echoed across continents. His victories were unmatched. His ambition seemed endless. From a young age, he was taught that to rule the world was his destiny. And so he marched. He marched across deserts, across rivers, across the lives of countless people who stood in his way. Each victory fed his belief that nothing could stop him. Each conquest whispered the same dangerous promise: that power outside could silence the chaos within. But here is the quiet truth history often hides. No matter how many lands he conquered, his mind never rested. No matter how many enemies fell, his anger remained. The world bent to his will, but his impulses did not. In moments of rage, he destroyed what he later regretted. In moments of pride, he ignored the counsel meant to save him. And in moments of silence, he was haunted by the emptiness conquest could not fill. This is where the story turns inward. Because this is not just the story of an emperor. It is the story of the human condition. We often believe that winning outside will quiet the noise inside. That success will bring peace. That control over others will somehow lead to control over ourselves. But history teaches us otherwise. The greatest empires have fallen not to enemies at the gate, but to unrest within. And the greatest victories have been lost to unchecked desire, anger, and pride. As this emperor stood at the height of his power, surrounded by fear and admiration, something was missing. Peace. Not the peace of silence after war, but the peace that comes from mastery of the self. This is the lesson whispered through centuries. That inner control is a harder conquest than any battlefield. And that without it, no victory is complete. Tonight, as you listen, allow this story to settle gently. You do not need to judge this emperor. You only need to observe. Because within his rise and unrest, there is a mirror. And in that mirror, a quiet question waits. What does it truly mean to win? As the empire expanded, the emperor's days became louder. Trumpets announced victories. Messengers arrived breathless with news of submission. The world responded to his presence with obedience. Yet inside, something remained unsettled. Power surrounded him, but it did not soothe him. Each success raised expectations. Each triumph demanded another. Rest felt undeserved. Stillness felt dangerous. When silence arrived, it brought discomfort. So the emperor filled it with motion. He planned further campaigns. He demanded loyalty. He watched closely for signs of hesitation. Control over others became a habit. A habit mistaken for strength. Those closest to him learned to measure their words. Advice was offered carefully. Silence was often safer. The emperor listened, but only when it aligned with his will. Contradiction felt like betrayal. Patience thinned. Temper grew shorter. Moments of anger left lasting marks. Decisions made in haste could not be taken back. Power amplified every impulse. Where a smaller man might pause, the emperor acted. Where reflection was needed, certainty rushed in. Outward authority masked inward unrest. The empire appeared stable. The ruler was not. He demanded discipline from his soldiers, but struggled to show it to himself. He commanded loyalty, but could not quiet his own doubts. The world praised his control. Yet control was precisely what he lacked. In private moments, unease surfaced. Not fear of defeat, but fear of stopping. Because stopping would require facing what conquest could not fix. The emperor had mastered strategy. He had mastered warfare. But he had not mastered himself. This imbalance quietly shaped his fate. Not through enemies, but through the steady erosion of restraint. History remembers his victories clearly. It remembers his temper less kindly. And it remembers the cost of unchecked power most of all. This is where the lesson deepens. Because strength without control does not create peace. It only delays collapse. As time passed, the emperor's victories began to lose their sweetness. The cheers sounded familiar. The celebrations repeated themselves. What once felt extraordinary slowly became expected. With each new conquest, satisfaction arrived later. And when it did, it stayed for a shorter time. The emperor noticed this, even if he did not speak of it. Moments that should have brought pride now felt strangely hollow. He stood at the center of power, yet felt no closer to peace. The world outside continued to yield, but the world within resisted. Sleep became lighter. Rest became harder to reach. His thoughts returned again and again to what still remained unconquered. Not lands, not rivals, but the restless movement of his own mind. In quieter moments, he felt a subtle pressure. A sense that something essential was being avoided. The emperor had learned to command silence from others. But he could not command it from himself. Memories surfaced without invitation. Decisions replayed themselves. Moments of anger returned with clarity. Power did not erase these thoughts. It amplified them. Those around him sensed the change. Conversations became more cautious. The room often felt tense even in stillness. The emperor spoke quickly. He decided firmly. Yet beneath the certainty was unease. He had conquered distance. He had conquered resistance. But he had not conquered impatience. He demanded calm from his empire, but struggled to find it within himself. Each day required more effort to maintain control. Not control over others, but control over reactions. Small frustrations felt larger. Delays felt personal. Opposition felt insulting. The emperor had no shortage of authority. What he lacked was ease. This tension did not announce itself loudly. It accumulated quietly, like weight carried for too long. The more he pushed forward, the heavier it became. Still, he continued. Because stopping felt unfamiliar. Because reflection required stillness. And stillness felt like weakness. This belief shaped his actions more than any enemy. It kept him moving when rest was needed. It kept him reacting when restraint was wiser. The emperor stood at the height of external power. Yet internally, balance was slipping. This was the quiet divide. The place where greatness and wisdom began to separate. And from this divide, the deeper lesson would soon emerge. There came a moment when the emperor could no longer ignore the pattern. It was not marked by defeat, nor by rebellion. It arrived quietly, in the space between victories. The empire was stable. The borders were secure. The armies were loyal. By every external measure, he had succeeded. And yet, the sense of unrest remained. In moments of solitude, the emperor felt exposed. Not to enemies, but to himself. He began to notice how quickly irritation arose. How small obstacles provoke strong reactions. How control over the world had not translated into calm. These realizations were uncomfortable. They challenged the story he had told himself. That dominance brought peace. That victory resolved uncertainty. That power silenced doubt. Instead, power seemed to magnify everything. Joy became fleeting. Anger became sharp. Expectation became relentless. The emperor began to sense that his greatest struggle was no longer external. It was internal. He could command armies to wait. But he could not command his own impulses to pause. He could demand restraint from others. But he rarely extended it to himself. This imbalance began to shape his decisions. Not through careful thought, but through reaction. He acted quickly. He spoke firmly. He justified speed as strength. But speed often replaced wisdom. Those closest to him sensed the shift. They watched his moods carefully. They adapted to avoid provoking unrest. The empire remained intact. But the atmosphere around its ruler grew fragile. This was not the fragility of weakness. It was the fragility of imbalance. The emperor had learned how to take. He had not learned how to stop. He had learned how to advance. He had not learned how to remain still. This was the turning point. The moment when conquest revealed its limit. Because no matter how far he expanded outward, the distance inward remained unchanged. And it was here, in this realization, that the story prepared to shift. As the days passed, the emperor began to sense a quiet contradiction. The more he expanded his reach, the more confined he felt. The world around him grew larger. Yet his inner space felt increasingly narrow. This awareness did not arrive as a sudden insight. It unfolded slowly, in pauses between commands, in moments when no one was watching. The emperor noticed how effort followed him everywhere. Even rest required control. Even silence felt occupied. He had learned to dominate circumstances, but he had never learned how to release them. There was always something to manage, something to secure, something to anticipate. The mind never stood still, and without stillness, clarity could not remain. He began to understand that conquest had trained him in motion, but it had not trained him in restraint. Every challenge was met with force. Every uncertainty was answered with action. There was no space left for patience, and no room for quiet judgment. The emperor sensed that this pattern carried a cost. Not one measured in territory, but one measured in balance. Without balance, strength became heavy. Without balance, authority became fragile. And without balance, even success felt unstable. He did not yet know how to change, but he could no longer deny that something was missing. The victories no longer answered his questions. They only delayed them. This realization did not weaken him. It unsettled him, because it suggested that mastery required a different kind of effort. An effort not directed outward, but inward. The emperor stood at the edge of a new understanding. One that could not be enforced. One that could not be commanded. It could only be practiced. This was the threshold. The point where power alone was no longer enough, and where wisdom would soon be required. Power changes the weight of every emotion. In an ordinary life, anger may pass quietly. It may fade before it causes harm. But in the life of an emperor, even a small impulse carries consequence. The emperor began to see how quickly reaction became action. A moment of irritation led to a command. A passing doubt led to suspicion. Words spoken in haste could not be gathered back. Authority gave speed to every decision, and speed often left wisdom behind. The emperor had been trained to act decisively. Hesitation was considered weakness. Deliberation was mistaken for doubt. Yet inside, he sensed that something important was being rushed. Each time he responded without pause, a subtle cost followed. Trust weakened. Distance grew. The atmosphere around him became careful and guarded. Those who served him adapted to his moods. They learned to speak only when the moment felt safe. This silence protected them, but it deprived him of truth. The emperor began to notice that loyalty driven by fear was fragile. Obedience did not always reflect respect, and authority did not guarantee clarity. He realized that impulse, when amplified by power, reshaped more than a single moment. It shaped relationships. It shaped trust. It shaped the future of his rule. The emperor had conquered armies with discipline. Yet he had not applied that same discipline inward. He demanded order from thousands, but allowed disorder within himself. Gradually, he understood that strength without restraint was unstable. It achieved results, but it eroded foundations. The cost of impulse was rarely immediate. It accumulated quietly, like small fractures beneath a polished surface. Outwardly, the empire remained firm. Inwardly, tension gathered. The emperor began to sense that mastery required something different. Not greater force. Not faster decisions. But the ability to pause. To observe emotion before acting upon it. To allow space between feeling and command. This space was unfamiliar. It felt uncertain. It required humility. Yet within that pause, he sensed the possibility of true strength. The emperor had always believed that strength was visible. It could be measured in territory. It could be counted in victories. It could be displayed through command. But slowly, a quieter understanding began to form. Strength that must always prove itself is rarely secure. He noticed how often he defended his authority. How quickly he corrected small disagreements. How firmly he responded to minor resistance. Each reaction was meant to protect power. Yet each reaction revealed dependence on it. The emperor began to question the difference between dominance and discipline. Dominance controlled others. Discipline controlled oneself. Dominance demanded obedience. Discipline required restraint. For years, he had confused the two. He had perfected dominance. He had neglected discipline. This realization unsettled him more than any enemy ever had. Because it suggested that his greatest weakness had grown alongside his success. The emperor reflected on moments when silence would have been stronger than speech. Moments when patience would have been wiser than speed. Moments when humility would have preserved trust. These were not dramatic failures. They were subtle missteps. Yet subtle patterns shape destinies. The emperor saw how image had quietly guided him. A ruler must appear certain. A ruler must appear fearless. A ruler must appear unshaken. But certainty without reflection hardens into pride. Fearlessness without awareness becomes recklessness. Unshaken resolve without humility isolates. He began to sense that true strength might look different. It might involve listening more than speaking. Waiting rather than reacting. Choosing calm over display. This form of strength was quieter. Less visible. Harder to measure. Yet it felt more stable. The emperor recognized that discipline required effort without audience. It required self-observation. Self-restraint. Self-honesty. No army could practice this for him. No advisor could enforce it. No title could grant it. It had to be cultivated within. The emperor began to notice another quiet force shaping his actions. It was not fear. It was not strategy. It was attachment. Attachment to image. Attachment to reputation. Attachment to the idea of being unconquerable. This attachment moved quietly beneath every decision. It influenced how he responded to disagreement. It shaped how he interpreted silence. It magnified even minor criticism. The emperor had conquered kingdoms. But he had become captive to his own image. He felt the need to appear decisive at all times. He felt the need to appear unwavering. He felt the need to prove that strength never faltered. This constant proving created tension. Not in the empire, but within himself. Every challenge became personal. Every hesitation seemed threatening. Every doubt felt like weakness. The emperor began to understand that pride disguises itself as confidence. But pride requires constant protection. It demands reaction. It resists correction. It refuses to pause. And in refusing to pause, it prevents growth. The emperor reflected on how often he had acted to defend pride rather than truth. How often speed had been chosen to avoid appearing uncertain. How often firmness had replaced understanding. These realizations were not dramatic. They were quiet. But they were steady. He sensed that attachment to image created invisible chains. The more he tried to protect the image, the less free he became. Freedom, he realized, did not come from conquering others. It came from releasing the need to appear invincible. This understanding did not erase pride immediately. But it softened it. It introduced space. And in that space, reflection began to grow. With this awareness, the emperor began to observe himself more carefully. He did not change overnight. He did not abandon authority. But he started to notice the space between feeling and action. In that small space, something new appeared. Choice. Before, emotion moved quickly. Reaction followed immediately. Command sealed the outcome. Now, he experimented with waiting. Not long. Not dramatically. Just enough to breathe before speaking. This brief pause felt unfamiliar. It felt slower than power usually allowed. Yet within that pause, clarity grew stronger. The emperor began to see that restraint required courage. It was easier to act. Easier to assert. Easier to prove. It was harder to remain calm while feeling challenged. Harder to listen without defending. Harder to accept uncertainty without reacting. This difficulty revealed something important. The true measure of strength was not how loudly it could command. It was how steadily it could remain centered. The emperor recognized that self-control was not weakness. It was discipline without audience. It required no applause. No recognition. No visible reward. Yet it strengthened him in ways conquest never had. When he waited before responding, tension lessened. When he listened fully, understanding deepened. When he allowed silence, wisdom surfaced. The empire did not shrink. Authority did not fade. But something inside him grew steadier. He realized that mastery over the self was a lifelong practice. It could not be achieved in a single campaign. It required daily attention. Moment by moment awareness. This was the beginning of a different kind of victory. As this new understanding settled, the emperor felt a quiet shift within himself. The shift was not dramatic. It did not change the empire overnight. But it changed how he viewed power. He began to ask a different question. Not how much more he could conquer, but how deeply he could understand himself. This question required honesty. It required him to admit that victory had limits. It required him to see that ambition alone could not bring peace. The emperor reflected on the years spent expanding outward. He had crossed mountains. He had crossed oceans. He had crossed the boundaries of nations. Yet he had never fully crossed the boundary within. He had rarely paused long enough to observe his own motives. Rarely questioned the impulses that drove him forward. Rarely examined the cost of constant striving. Now, as awareness grew, he understood something simple and steady. Control over others may expand influence. But control over oneself creates freedom. Freedom from anger. Freedom from pride. Freedom from the need to prove strength at every moment. The emperor sensed that this freedom was greater than any territory. It could not be taken. It could not be forced. It could only be cultivated. This realization softened his view of success. Success was no longer measured only in expansion. It was measured in steadiness, in patience, in the quiet strength to pause before acting. The emperor had conquered much of the world. But he now understood that the most meaningful conquest remained within. And that realization prepared him for a deeper kind of wisdom. There is a battle that does not appear on maps. It is not marked by borders. It is not measured in victories. It unfolds quietly within the mind. The emperor began to recognize this inner battlefield. It did not require armies. It required awareness. For years, he had directed his strength outward. Now he turned a small portion of that strength inward. He observed how thoughts arose, how emotions formed, how quickly they sought expression. Instead of commanding them, he began to watch them. Instead of reacting immediately, he allowed them to pass. This practice was unfamiliar. It felt slower than conquest. Yet it felt steadier. The emperor noticed that emotions, when observed calmly, lost their urgency. Anger softened when it was not fed. Pride weakened when it was not defended. Fear eased when it was acknowledged. This inner battle required no audience. No applause. No announcement. It required patience, consistency, humility. He realized that mastering the self did not mean suppressing emotion. It meant understanding it, allowing space for it, choosing response over impulse. This was the hardest campaign he had ever undertaken, because the opponent was not separate from him. It was woven into his habits, his patterns, his instincts. Yet within this quiet effort, he sensed a deeper strength emerging. A strength not dependent on territory, not dependent on reputation, not dependent on fear. It was steady, measured, calm. And in that calm, the Emperor found something he had long sought: peace. As the Emperor continued this inward practice, the world around him did not disappear. The empire still required decisions. Advisors still presented concerns. Challenges still arose without warning. But something subtle had changed. His responses grew slower. Not weaker, but steadier. Where once he reacted instantly, he now listened. Where once he defended quickly, he now considered. Where once he raised his voice, he now lowered it. This shift did not make him less powerful. It made him less driven by impulse. He began to understand that calm authority carries more weight than force. Silence, when chosen wisely, can guide more effectively than command. The Emperor noticed that when he remained composed, others followed that tone. Tension in the room softened. Conversations deepened. Trust quietly strengthened. He had once believed that power required constant assertion. Now he saw that true authority rests in stability. Stability begins within. Without inner steadiness, outer control is fragile. With inner steadiness, even uncertainty becomes manageable. The Emperor recognized that peace is not found by eliminating every challenge. It is found by responding to challenges without losing balance. This realization reshaped his understanding of victory. Victory was no longer the defeat of opposition. It was the preservation of clarity. It was the maintenance of calm in the presence of pressure. It was the ability to remain centered while the world shifted. In this quieter form of strength, the Emperor discovered something enduring. Not dominance. Not control over others. But control over himself. In this slower rhythm, the Emperor discovered a practice. It was simple, almost unremarkable. Yet it required steady attention. When emotion rose, he did not deny it. He noticed it. He named it quietly within. He allowed it to exist without command. This practice created distance. Not distance from responsibility, but distance from impulse. Anger became a sensation to observe. Pride became a thought to examine. Fear became a signal to understand. In observing these movements, he discovered they were temporary. They arrived. They lingered. They faded. They did not require immediate action. They required awareness. This awareness steadied him. It prevented words spoken in haste. It softened decisions formed in frustration. It strengthened restraint in moments of pressure. The emperor realized that mastery was not control through force. It was control through understanding. Understanding the rise of emotion. Understanding the nature of thought. Understanding the value of pause. He began to trust this pause. Within it, clarity gathered. Within it, intention replaced reaction. Within it, balance returned. This inner discipline did not diminish his strength. It refined it. It made it precise. It made it calm. And in that calm refinement, the emperor experienced a deeper form of victory. Over time, the emperor's understanding settled into something steady. He no longer chased every reaction. He no longer defended every image. He no longer mistook speed for strength. The empire still existed. The responsibilities remained. The world continued to move. But within him, there was a new stillness. This stillness was not passive. It was attentive. It was aware. He began to see that inner control is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of balance. Emotion could rise. Thoughts could form. But they no longer ruled him. The emperor had once believed that conquering the world would bring fulfillment. Now he understood that fulfillment begins within. Territory can expand endlessly. Desire can grow without limit. Ambition can always seek more. But without self-mastery, none of it brings rest. True victory, he realized, is quiet. It does not require announcement. It does not depend on recognition. It is felt internally. It is the ability to remain steady when challenged. It is the capacity to pause before speaking. It is the discipline to choose clarity over impulse. In mastering himself, the emperor discovered a freedom greater than conquest. A freedom from the constant need to prove strength. A freedom from pride that demanded protection. A freedom from restless ambition. And in that freedom, there was peace. Not the peace of silence after war, but the peace of inner alignment. You can stop striving now. There is nothing left to conquer tonight. No victories to secure. No image to defend. The world can continue without your effort. Your mind does not need to command anything. You are allowed to rest. Let the need to control fade gently. Let the day release its weight. Breathing continues on its own. Your body knows how to soften. Your thoughts can slow without being pushed away. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be proven. Sleep is already near. Let it arrive quietly. Good night.